right, everybody. Thank you so much for attending for me this morning, for you this afternoon. I do appreciate everybody's attention today. And Gilbert, thank you very much for having me. I I've been to Africa twice. I've been to Arusha, Tanzania, in 2010 and 2014. So I'm not there with you now, but this is kind of a virtual return. So we'll go ahead and get started this afternoon. A little bit about myself. I've been working in cybersecurity, or what we used to call information security, for well, in another month, it'll be 24 years. So I spent several years in the United States military prior to that. I've been doing digital forensics and incident response work for almost 20 years, a little bit more than 20 years now. I'm a published author and a public speaker, as you can see from today's presentation. And there on the screen, I've got a copy of my most recently published book. I'm also the author and maintainer of several open source tools, to include Redripper, which you might be familiar with. In today's presentation, we're going to talk about reimagining the digital forensics and incident response model. And we'll talk a little bit today about what the model currently looks like from a high level, and then what are things that we can do to really turn that model on its head and really improve, make great strides in improving how things are done in digital forensics, especially as a component of incident response. So where are we today? Well, pretty much where we are today is really no different from where we were, say, 22, 23 years ago, at least by my reckoning. When I got out of the military and started working in the private sector, I worked at a company where we were doing vulnerability assessments. And my team had one team member that just did digital forensics. And he worked on his own. And he pretty much what he did was pretty consistent work. It was, he would receive hard drives and he would go through a process that he had at the time, and he would apply his knowledge and his understanding and his experience to that data. Okay, and that's pretty much how it worked. So he worked pretty hard at what he did. He was pretty diligent. But everything that he did was based solely on his own knowledge and his own experience. We really didn't have what I would refer to today as the internet at the time. Yes, of course, we had internet connectivity. We had things like AOL. We had Prodigy. You know, this is the late 90s, but I don't think Google was really in existence at the time as a resource for examiners and analysts. So, the facility that he had to really engage with others and learn from the history of others was really somewhat limited. And we call this analysis is the term that we use. And when you really think about it, this is pretty much how it works. Usually a single analyst will get some data, whether it's a single hard drive or multiple hard drives or several files, and they will use some tools to which they have a certain level of knowledge about, and they will apply those tools to parsing the data that they have, and they will apply their own knowledge and experience to that data. And that's what we refer to as analysis. And so this is somewhat of a crude graphic, but and it's pretty much the extent of my capabilities with PowerPoint. I don't claim to be a graphic artist, but this is pretty much the current model. Again, this is a fairly high level. An analyst gets data in. They may apply some indicators of compromise, some IOCs. For instance, some folks that I'm familiar with right now, there's a use of keyword searches for things like IP addresses, for file names. They'll search for file hashes. And even though this is something that we see done today, this is something that's been done pretty extensively over the last, say, quarter century. But this is what seems to, from fairly high levels, seems to constitute analysis. I think this also applies in a much broader sense than just looking at individual analysts. When I worked for IBM, I was on the team that did what we referred to as PCI investigations. I think they're referred to as PFI now, but these are the forensic cases that you do for the PCI Council when there's credit card theft. And the way that the PCI Council, specifically Visa at the time, had wanted these investigations done, and the kind of the boundaries that they put around them pretty much followed along this same model. They were Visa would provide IOCs to the forensic analysts and require that searches be conducted. So we would get lists of hashes, we would get lists of file names, we would get lists of folders and directories, usually in separate batches and separate buckets, not related to each other. For example, we wouldn't get a file name and associated with a file path and a hash. We would get a bunch of hashes, we would get a bunch of file names, we would get a bunch of file paths all separately. And we would be required to do searches for these items. And as part of the reporting, we had a dashboard across the report that said, okay, here's what we found with respect to the most recent list. But again, this is again, it's a fairly high level, but this is what the current model for digital forensics as it's associated with incident response tends to look like. I was, like I said before, I was in the United States military. I was an officer in the United States Marine Corps. I read Jim Mattis's book, Call Sign Chaos, and one particular statement stood out for me, specifically as it relates to what we're talking about today and digital forensics analysis in general. And that was, your personal experiences alone are not broad enough to sustain you. And again, that statement really, really stood out to me, because what it's basically saying, and it's really very true. Retired General Mattis is saying that his experiences as a warrior and a war fighter alone weren't broad enough to sustain him. And I'm applying this to digital forensics in the sense that an individual analyst's experiences, whether they go to training, whether they look at different types of engagements, perform different kinds of analysis, and they may be limited as such. They may, like, for instance, I'm in the private sector, and I spend a lot of time. In fact, when I was doing digital forensics and incident response on a regular basis, I do this all day long. Whereas somebody in the government or somebody in law enforcement may have other things that they need to do during the day. So they may be very limited in the amount of time they actually spend doing these activities during, say, a given week. As such, their personal experiences may not be broad enough to sustain them in the long term. So the question is how do we take this? And if we're going to say this is a true statement, what can we do to extend an individual analyst's experiences? Well, we have tools available to us. For instance, I think most people are familiar with tools like Encase, FTK. I think Magnet Axiom is something a little bit more recent. I know that Brian Carrier has really taken a lot of effort in developing Autopsy as a freely available framework. All of these tools are great, and they're great at parsing and displaying various artifacts from different types of systems, whether it be Windows, going all the way back to Windows XP, or we move away from Windows systems and get into Linux and Mac systems, and even moving into cell phones. A lot of tools that we have are very, very good at parsing and displaying the artifacts, but we still need to be, the tools still need to be directed by the user, not the other way around. Unfortunately, what I see more and more, and this is probably just because there's more and more people in the community, but what I see more and more is the statement, well, the tool didn't show me. In fact, I saw that statement earlier this week, where a statement was made that the tool I was using didn't collect that file, so it must not be important. Users need to direct the tool, not the other way around. We need to move away from that. Users still need to correctly interpret the data, correctly and accurately interpret the data. They need to understand what the context of the data is. For example, one of the biggest data artifacts that we see on Windows systems that is most widely misinterpreted on a regular basis is what we refer to as the app compact cache. This is a value that lists a path to a file on a system with a complete directory path all the way to the file, and it comes with a timestamp. And very often this timestamp is interpreted by analysts as being the time that that file was executed. And that is not actually a correct interpretation. That was true with a very specific version of Windows XP, but that data had two timestamps associated with it. What we're seeing with Windows 7, and I say Windows 7 because I was just encountering a Windows 7 just last week for forensic analysis, but more often with Windows 10 and moving now into Windows 11, we need to make sure that these data elements that we're looking at are correctly interpreted. And this is not something that tools can necessarily do for us. This is up to the individual analyst to do. We need to go beyond striving for sufficiency. We need to seek out context. And what I mean by striving for sufficiency is, especially within the private sector, within forensics consulting, is you see analysts just trying to answer the questions. Was something on the system? Did something happen on the system? For instance, when you're looking at these nation-state actors or cybercrime cases, one of the elements that we tend to look for very often is persistence. And an analyst may go and find the persistence and just leave it at that. But I've been involved with EDR tools, endpoint detection and response tools, for quite some time now, going back to even before Carbon Black was version 1.0 and before carbonblack.com existed. One of the things that we see when you look at this data, when you look at the data across multiple organizations, you look at the data across multiple events and attacks, is that in many, many cases, the actors will spend a great deal of time configuring the infrastructure to meet their own needs. They will disable security tools, for example, and we see this in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. They will, for instance, turn antivirus off, or disable Windows Defender, or enable functionality on a Windows system that allow them to do certain things. And by not looking at those items, by not going after those particular data elements and not trying to determine, going beyond simply did they persist and how did they persist, but going beyond that and seeing what else they did on the systems, that's actually striving for sufficiency, where we can get a great deal more context. I remember specifically with the PCI cases that I was working, one of the pieces of information that was very, very important to the PCI Council was dwell time, or how long the threat actors had been on the system. And then later, one of the things they wanted to know is, okay, well, what did they do while they were on these systems? And very often at the time, that was somewhat limited. But as we move more and more, as we see more and more of emerging between tactics used by nation states and tactics used in cybercrime, we see that the threat actors will gain access and spend a considerable amount of time within the infrastructure, very often configuring the infrastructure to meet their own needs. So that's something very, very important to keep in mind. Okay, so we're talking about reimagining the digital forensics incident response model, and this approach that we currently use is arbitrarily limiting, and I think unfortunately it's very accepted as such. It's something that we can extend. It does need to change. Those of us in this presentation, those of us attending, and those of us doing this work need to change it. We need to work together to do that. Okay, so this is a bit more complicated, but this is a proposal, if you will, for a new model. You can see that we have the original elements where the data comes in, and there's analysis as the analyst applies their experience to the data, and then it goes out to the report. But we have some interesting some additional elements to this. For example, instead of just applying IOCs in a keyword search, we can go out and we can review open reporting from various sources. We can do our own research. We can conduct threat hunting, either across infrastructures or within the data that we have itself, doing post-mortem or DFIR threat hunting. We can, by reviewing the open reporting, we can apply TTPs and artifact constellations to that data and determine if they exist. And have they changed? Have those artifact constellations been modified in some way, indicating a potential evolution in a threat actor? And I think the most important aspect of this model, it really is the feedback loop that we've got. And so instead of just working an engagement, finishing the report, moving on to the next thing, what we need to do is we need to have analysts that have a codified means of applying what they learned from one engagement or one analysis and putting that back into a feedback loop so that it is applied to all engagements going forward. And in this model, we can extend this model by incorporating or applying it across all the analysts. So, for example, I've worked on teams with as few as 4 or as many as 12 additional analysts. So if we're each applying our own experiences and knowledge to the data, that's very, very limited. For instance, I might get, for just myself, I might get several malware cases where a customer calls in and says, we think a system's infected. Can you help us determine if it's malware? And I might, for instance, find a botnet, or I might find something of interesting. For example, several years ago, I was working with a hospital in North Carolina that had some malware on their system, and we found a Windows service, and we kept deleting the service, but it kept coming back. And it turns out that particular malware actually consisted of 2 services. The one that we found that was rather obvious was the actual malware, and the additional one that wasn't quite as obvious and took a little bit of additional analysis. It was just intended to ensure that the malware was running, and that was pretty much it. So that's why it kept coming back. So we had to go and delete all of the services, the pairing of services on all the systems. But this is information that I had based on my experience. Now I can tell another analyst about this, but if I have an automated means, a way to codify this so that when the data is received, there is a considerable amount of pre-processing, automated pre-processing done by computers very, very fast, that goes through and the data and says, based on all the previous findings of all the previous analysts, here are some important things that you need to look at, or here are some bad things that you need to review. And again, this is very, very beneficial, because what it means is that if I find something, and then I find something new, for example, a new version of the DLL search order attack, for example. If I find something that's new with those regards, but I don't tell anybody, I take it with me. I can apply it to my next case and to future cases if I can remember, but I take it with me, and nobody else knows about it. But if I put it into this process, if I put it into this feedback loop, and it is applied into the pre-processing that's performed prior to the individual analyst getting the data, that means that what I learned and my experience is now available to everybody. And it's there even if I'm on vacation. It's there if I'm out sick. It's there if I leave the company and move on to another organization. So we have a great deal of benefit if we have a means for developing and retaining corporate knowledge. Now, I do think that there are a great many facilities available to us for retaining the corporate knowledge. For instance, there's the MISP framework, MISP. I've used that before when I was at CrowdStrike. It's very, very beneficial. It's got some great facilities to be able to go back and look at historical data. But the key that's different in this model that we're talking about right now, that's on the screen, that's different from the original model that we're using, is developing that corporate knowledge, actually going beyond just sufficiency and saying, look, I've got this additional information. I've developed something that goes beyond just the confines of sufficiency in the analysis that I did, and I'm applying it back into the parsing. The tools do a great job of parsing, but applying it to the data presentation by saying, look, I've got all of this data I'm looking at, but here are the things that are really, really important. Here are the things that others have encountered in the past and have learned from, and I can develop that as well. Some of the sources from open reporting, for example, FireEye is a great source. I've seen a great number of their presentations over the years, or their blog posts. There's some that are very recent. There's one from November 2018 that I thought was absolutely fascinating. It's the first time I'd seen a specific data source used in the way that it was. And to be quite honest, here we are almost 3 years later, and I have not yet seen that. It's almost as if nobody noticed. Palo Alto's Unit 42 has got some excellent information. And then the DFIR report, again, has got some very, very good information. I've seen something very recently. There's another very, very good resource is the research done by individual analysts. So we can't all be doing just digital forensics all the time. We have to have time at least to either go to training or do some research to extend our own knowledge. I know personally, I've got a list of projects that I want to work on, and I try to apply the time when I have it available to do some research into different areas, whether it's registry research or researching a new artifact or just researching the use of an artifact. How is it actually being used? We also have the output of threat hunting, the outcomes of threat hunting. One of the things that I saw when I was at CrowdStrike specifically was there was a great facility for finding something, but then looking at all the activity around it that really kind of stands out. And, I found it very interesting a lot of times, some of the activities that threat actors would do to prepare or to not only prepare an infrastructure, but in response to different things that were going on. For example, if antivirus deleted their tool, or if the EDR tool itself blocked their activity, being able to see what they did was very, very profound in response to that stimulus. We can also rely on other analysts' experiences, but have it codified in a way that we can actually use it. Have it written down, I guess, is a good way to think about it, but not like on a piece of paper in a notepad document or in a wiki. Have it codified in a way that we can use it, that it's actionable to us. And some, again, some of the different sources. I know that a lot of times the words that we see on the screen in a bullet don't necessarily really resonate with us too well, but there's FireEye, there's the DFIR report, there's Palo Alto. And actually the one I've got listed for the FireEye report is something that popped up very, very recently that I thought was very, very important to understand with respect to ransomware, and that has to do with affiliates and the supply chain compromise. Okay, some of the outcomes and implementations that we would expect to see were, I mentioned analysts codifying their findings. We have Yara rules, for example. I know that over the years, I've found a great utility in Yara rules that I can find online that have to do with, say, the China Chopper web shell that we find on systems. They're very, very useful. They can be very, very powerful, and they're a great starting point if you're not familiar with something. When I was at Nuix, for example, Nuix provides a product called either Workstation or Investigator. One of the things that I did while I was at that company is I worked with the developers to provide functionality so that when data was brought into the Workstation or the Investigator platform, you could run Yara rules against it. So you would start by going out and downloading Yara rules from various sources. And these rules are generally text-based, and they have information with respect to when they were developed and to whom they are attributed. But they provide a great facility to get you started. And once you start getting into the data and digging into it, you can then apply your own research and develop those rules as you encounter new things. Volatility plugins are another excellent resource that to come out of your analysis. I've got analysts working for me right now that are currently using volatility, and I know most of the programmers within the volatility project. And I also know that it's either every year or every other year they have a volatility plugin contest to see who can develop something new. So these things are always being developed. But you can create your own plugin based on information that you're seeing. And by creating that plugin and sharing it with other analysts in your group or other analysts in your country, you've now extended the capabilities and shared that corporate knowledge so that all analysts have access to that knowledge without having had that experience. Redripper plugins are another fantastic resource. And these provide a codified means for applying the knowledge and experience through automation. And now something else we can also look at is techniques. Like, what are some of the different techniques? One of the examples that I share in my book that I had on the first slide, Investigating Windows Systems, was one of the images that I use actually came with a memory dump. And I not only applied volatility ran volatility against it, but I also ran bulk extractor and collected a PCAP file. And what was really interesting about that was bulk extractor uses a different technique to look for network-based information within the memory dump. as such, there was information available from bulk extractor that wasn't available from volatility. And so I shared that technique, and I actually share that with my analysts now, and ensure that they use both processes. So solutions for now. What can we do to achieve this right now? I know that talking to different folks over the last decade or decade and a half, there seems to be a reticence, because there really isn't a platform for sharing this sort of thing. And it doesn't, most organizations don't want it shared publicly. They don't want the information out there. I don't think that's really the issue. I think that more than anything else, because what we've seen as a result is when a platform is set up, it's not used. I think more than anything else is there's not really an understanding about how to go beyond sufficiency. So what we need to do is we need to focus on active, purposeful engagement. So we get an understanding. Hey, I saw this thing. Oh, right, great. What does it look like? How do I detect it in my system? How can I find that in my data? And then what we do is, following that active and purposeful engagement, we contribute. We contribute back to the tools that we were using. We write Yara rules. We write plugins. We can write plugins for volatility. We can create processes. We can create content. A lot of the information that I find through open source research and open reporting also includes blog posts that others have put together. So sharing that information is just a great way to start. So it's not so much that we don't really have a platform for sharing it, it's that we're really not developing it for sharing. So at this point, we're at the top of the hour, or in your case, the bottom of the hour. And I just wanted to see if we have any questions at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out of the presentation. I'm going to leave this up here for just a second so you can see my contact information. But I'm going to get out of the presentation and see if there's any questions.